No babysitter lasted with the billionaire's twin sons, until a maid's daughter walked into their lives and changed everything they thought love couldn't fix. The Anderson mansion had everything money could buy, except peace. 12 nannies had come and gone, each leaving with the same words on their lips: "Those boys can't be saved." But then, a quiet voice in the hallway said, "They're not bad, they're just lost." That voice didn't belong to a therapist or a teacher. It belonged to an 11-year-old girl with a dust rag in her hand. What began as a desperate father's last attempt to restore order ended as a journey that rebuilt a broken home. This is the story of how a maid's daughter taught a billionaire that love can't be hired, and sometimes the smallest anchor can calm the fiercest storm. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. Some fires can only be put out with a gentle rain, not a flood. The silence in the sprawling mansion was a fragile thing, easily broken. In the cavernous playroom on the second floor, it shattered like a dropped plate. James Anderson stood in the doorway of the playroom, a fortress of toys and unopened books that had become a battlefield. His 6-year-old twin sons, Leo and Owen, were at war. A tower of expensive wooden blocks, imported from Germany, had been toppled. A stuffed giraffe, its neck bent at an unnatural angle, lay in the crossfire. Leo, his face a mask of furious tears, clutched a bright red fire truck. Owen, his expression equally stormy, was trying to wrestle it from his brother's grasp. "It's mine," Leo shrieked, his small body trembling with rage. "No, it's mine," Owen roared back, his voice a mirror of his brother's. This was the scene that had greeted the last nanny, a woman with a PhD in child psychology, just before she'd quit. She had lasted 3 days. The one before her, a stern British woman with impeccable references, had lasted a week. In the 2 years since his wife, Eleanor, had passed away, James had hired and lost 12 nannies. Each one had left with a strained smile and a check that could have bought a small car, muttering about the boys being unmanageable. James, a man who could command a boardroom of cutthroat executives with a single, quiet word, felt a familiar wave of helplessness wash over him. He was a billionaire, a titan of industry, but he was failing at the one job that mattered most. He saw his late wife in the defiant set of their jaws, in the fierce loyalty they showed to each other, even in their anger. But he didn't know how to reach them. He had tried everything: therapists, reward charts, strict schedules, and an endless river of toys. Nothing worked. The grief in his house had curdled into a constant, simmering anger. He was about to step in, to use the firm, detached voice that always failed to calm them, when he heard a soft sound behind him. He turned to see Sarah Carter, his housekeeper, standing in the hallway. She was a quiet, dependable woman who had been with him for the past year. She kept her head down, and her work was flawless. Beside her, holding a dust rag in one small hand, was her daughter, Emily. Emily was 11 years old, with blonde hair tied back in a neat ponytail and eyes the color of a summer sky. They were calm, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. She was looking past James, into the playroom, at the raging storm that was his son's. She wasn't shocked or frightened. She was watching, her expression one of intense focus, as if she were studying a complicated puzzle. Sarah put a hand on her daughter's shoulder, a silent apology for the intrusion. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Anderson," she whispered. "Emily, come along. Let's not disturb Mr. Anderson and the boys." But Emily didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on the twins. Owen had finally ripped the fire truck from Leo's hands and was now holding it above his head like a trophy. Leo, defeated, had crumpled to the floor, his small body racked with sobs. Owen's victory was hollow. He looked at the truck in his hands, then at his weeping brother, and a look of confusion and misery crossed his face. He hadn't wanted the truck, he had wanted the fight. "They're not bad boys," a small voice said. James looked down. Emily was looking up at him, her expression serious. "They're just lost," she said. "Their anchor is gone, so they're making big waves to see if they can hit the shore." James stared at her, taken aback by the simple, profound metaphor. He had heard a dozen experts try to explain his son's behavior in complex, clinical terms. None of them had made as much sense as this 11-year-old girl. "What do you know about anchors?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. My great-grandpa was in the Navy, Emily replied, her gaze unwavering. Sergeant Elias Vance. He said that a ship in a storm without an anchor is just a piece of driftwood. It gets tossed around by the waves until it breaks apart on the rocks. He said people are the same way. Sarah looked mortified. Emily, you shouldn't be bothering Mr. Anderson. I'm so sorry, sir. James held up a hand, silencing her. He crouched down slightly to be on Emily's level. So what do you suggest I do, Emily? I seem to be fresh out of anchors. Emily's expression was earnest. You don't need a nanny, Mr. Anderson. You've tried that. They're like captains who come on board and try to steer the ship in a new direction. But the crew, Leo and Owen, they don't trust a new captain. They'll just fight him. She took a small breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say next. What they need is someone who can just be in the boat with them. Not to steer it, but just to be there. A friend. James felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. And who did you have in mind for this friend? Emily looked him straight in the eye. Me, she said. Just for a week. A 1-week trial. I'll spend time with them. I won't be their nanny. I won't tell them what to do. I'll just be here. With them. We can build things, or read, or just sit. Whatever they want. James was about to dismiss the idea. It was absurd. She was a child herself. What could she possibly do that a team of professionals could not? But then he looked into the playroom at his 2 miserable sons, and he looked at the quiet confidence in Emily's eyes. He was desperate. And sometimes, desperation makes you listen to the quietest voice in the room. 1 week, he said, the words surprising even himself. No trouble. The moment there is any trouble, any at all, the deal is off. And you will be paid for your time, of course. Emily shook her head. This isn't a job, Mr. Anderson. You can't pay a friend to be a friend. The only condition is that you let me do this my way. Her mother looked like she was about to faint, but James found himself nodding. All right, Emily. Your way. For 1 week. Emily smiled, a small, genuine smile that lit up her face. Thank you, sir, she said. She then walked past him and into the playroom. She didn't approach the boys. She didn't say a word to them. She walked over to the corner of the room, where a large, forgotten dollhouse sat covered in a thin layer of dust. She sat down on the floor in front of it and began to quietly arrange the miniature furniture. Leo's sobs subsided into sniffles. He and Owen both watched her, their tear-stained faces a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. She didn't look at them. She hummed a soft, tuneless melody as she moved a tiny chair from one room to another. After a full 5 minutes of this silent, focused activity, Leo crept a little closer. What are you doing? He asked, his voice thick with tears. Emily looked up at him, her expression calm and friendly. I'm getting this house ready, she said. The family that lives here, they've been on a long, hard trip, and they're finally coming home. Owen, still clutching the red fire truck, inched closer as well. What family? He asked. Emily looked at the dollhouse, then at the 2 boys. I don't know yet, she said thoughtfully. I'm still waiting for them to tell me their story. For the first time all morning, the playroom was completely quiet. Not the fragile, tense silence of a ceasefire, but a new kind of silence. One filled with a question. James Anderson stood in the doorway, a billionaire in a bespoke suit, and watched as a maid's daughter began to do the one thing he had failed to do. She wasn't trying to control the storm. She was just sitting in it, patiently waiting for the waves to calm. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt a tiny, fragile glimmer of hope. The next morning, Emily arrived not with a list of activities or a schedule, but with a worn copy of Treasure Island and a small, determined smile. She found the boys in the living room, a vast, museum-like space with high ceilings and furniture so expensive it seemed to repel comfort. They were watching cartoons on a television the size of a movie screen, their faces blank, the volume turned up to a deafening roar. Emily didn't ask them to turn it down. She didn't suggest they do something else. She simply sat on the floor, a good 10 feet away from them, and opened her book. She began to read aloud, her voice not much louder than a whisper. It was a fool's errand, trying to compete with the explosions and laser blasts on the screen. I remember him as if it were yesterday, as he came plodding to the inn door, his sea chest following behind him in a hand barrow. Leo glanced over at her, his expression annoyed. He turned the volume on the TV up even higher. Emily didn't flinch. She just kept reading, her voice as steady, quiet stream against the torrent of cartoon noise. A tall, strong, heavy, nut-brown man, his tarry pigtail falling over the shoulder of his soiled blue coat. After 10 minutes of this, Owen, bored with the cartoon, finally got up and walked over to her. He stood over her, scowling. "We can't hear you," he said, a challenge in his voice. "I know," Emily said, not looking up from her book. "This story isn't for the whole room. It's a secret. It's only for people who are close enough to hear it." She continued reading. Owen hesitated for a moment. Then, with a huff, he sat down on the floor a few feet away from her. A minute later, Leo, unable to resist the pull of his brother's curiosity, muted the television and joined him. Emily read for an hour. She used different voices for the characters, her tone rising and falling with the rhythm of the sea. She didn't stop to ask them questions or to see if they were paying attention. She just gave them the story, a gift with no strings attached. When she finished the 3rd chapter, she closed the book. "That's all for now," she said. "Why?" Leo demanded, his voice betraying his interest. "What happens next?" "The rest is for tomorrow," Emily said, standing up. "Stories need to breathe." Later that day, she found them in the playroom, listlessly pushing toy cars back and forth. The energy of the previous day's fight was gone, replaced by a sullen boredom. "I was thinking," Emily said, her voice casual. "This room is too big. It's hard to feel safe in a room this big." The boys looked at her, then around the cavernous room. They had never thought of it that way, but she was right. It was a room designed by an adult to impress other adults, not a place for 2 small boys to feel cozy. "My great-grandpa," she said, her voice dropping a little, as if sharing a secret. "He had to build forts all the time. In the war, he said a good fort isn't about keeping everyone out. It's about making a safe place for your own people." Owen's eyes lit up. "Can we build a fort?" "I don't know," Emily said, feigning uncertainty. "A fort is a lot of work. It needs a good engineer and a strong construction crew." "I'm the engineer," Leo declared. "I'm the construction crew," Owen shouted. For the next 2 hours, the playroom was a hive of activity. Under Emily's quiet guidance, they dragged every cushion, pillow, and blanket from the sofas in the living room. They used chairs for support beams and a large, velvet throw as a roof. They worked together, their earlier squabbles forgotten, replaced by a shared purpose. Leo, the engineer, meticulously planned where each wall should go. Owen, the construction crew, hauled the heavy cushions into place. James came home that evening to a sight that stopped him in his tracks. In the middle of his perfectly decorated, multi-million-dollar living room, there was a monstrous, lopsided fortress of pillows and blankets. It was a glorious mess, and from inside it, he could hear something he hadn't heard in years, the sound of his son's laughing. Not the wild, manic laughter of a tantrum, but a genuine, happy sound. He walked closer and peered through an opening in the blanket door. Inside, by the light of a single flashlight, sat Emily and his 2 sons. They were eating peanut butter sandwiches on paper plates, a feast in their new castle. "No grown-ups allowed," Owen said, his mouth full of sandwich, but there was no malice in his voice. "This is Fort Anderson," Leo added proudly. "It's for us." James looked at Emily, who simply gave him a small, knowing smile. He saw then that she hadn't just taught them how to build a fort. She had taught them how to build a space for themselves, a refuge from a world that had become too big and too sad for them. She had given them back a small piece of their childhood. That night, as he tucked his sons into bed, they were still buzzing with excitement. "Emily said that a fort is only as strong as the people inside it," Leo mumbled sleepily. "And she said we're the strongest people in the world," Owen added, his eyes already closed. James stood in the doorway of their room, looking at their peaceful faces. He thought of the 12 nannies who had tried to impose order on his son's chaos. They had all failed. And then came this 11-year-old girl, who understood that sometimes the only way to deal with chaos is to build a fortress of pillows right in the middle of it. He walked back down to the living room and looked at the ridiculous, wonderful fort. He smiled, a real smile, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The week was not yet over, but something was already starting to change in the quiet, lonely halls of the Anderson mansion. A gentle rain had begun to fall. The next day brought a new challenge, one that came not from the boys, but from the outside world. James's older sister, Charlotte Davis, arrived for her weekly visit. Charlotte was a woman who moved through the world as if it were a series of rooms that needed to be redecorated. She was tall, elegant, and had a voice that could curdle milk. She believed that children, especially boys, needed structure, discipline, and a healthy dose of fear. She had long advocated for Leo and Owen to be sent to a boarding school on the East Coast, a place that specialized in taming unruly children of the wealthy. She swept into the house, her eyes immediately landing on the half-disassembled pillow fort in the living room. Her perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up. "Good heavens, James," she said, her voice dripping with disapproval. "What is this? It looks like a fraternity house." "The boys were playing," James said, his voice neutral. "Playing?" Charlotte scoffed. "They should be studying. Or practicing their French. They are 6 years old. The formative years are slipping away." She found the boys in the backyard with Emily. They weren't playing on the expensive swing set or the custom-built climbing frame. They were on their hands and knees in the dirt, in a small, neglected patch of garden behind the guest house. Emily was showing them how to pull up weeds. "This was my great-grandpa's favorite thing to do," Emily was saying, her voice calm and steady. "He said that a garden is like a person. You have to pull out the weeds, the anger, the sadness, so that the good things have room to grow." Leo held up a long, stubborn weed, its roots caked in dirt. "This is a really angry one," he said with a grunt. Charlotte watched from the perfectly manicured lawn, her arms crossed, her face a mask of disbelief. "James, are you serious?" she hissed, turning to her brother. "You have them doing manual labor? With the maid's daughter? What on earth were you thinking?" "Her name is Emily," James said, a defensive edge to his voice. "And they're happy." "They're filthy," Charlotte corrected him. "And this is completely inappropriate. A child should not be responsible for raising other children. What qualifications does she have? What is her methodology?" Before James could answer, a small crisis erupted in the garden. Owen, trying to pull up a particularly large weed, had accidentally knocked over a small watering can, splashing muddy water all over Leo's shirt. The old Leo would have exploded. He would have screamed, or pushed his brother, or run crying into the house. Charlotte braced herself for the inevitable tantrum. But Leo just looked at the muddy patch on his shirt. He looked at Owen, whose face was already crumpling, expecting a fight. Then he looked at Emily, who was watching them calmly, saying nothing. She had made a rule on the first day, a simple, unspoken rule. She would not solve their problems for them. She was there to help them find their own solutions. Leo took a deep breath. "It's okay, Owen," he said, his voice a little shaky. "It's just dirt. We can wash it off." Owen stared at his brother, his eyes wide with surprise. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "Okay," he said. Charlotte was speechless. She had never seen either of them walk away from a fight. She looked from the boys to Emily, who was now quietly showing them how to pat the soil down around a small, struggling rose bush. "How did she do that?" Charlotte whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and suspicion. "I don't think she did anything," James said, a slow realization dawning on him. "I think she's just teaching them how to do it themselves." Charlotte was not so easily convinced. She saw this not as progress, but as a threat. For months, she had been positioning herself as the only one who could save her brother and his sons. This quiet, unassuming little girl was undoing all of her carefully laid plans. She marched over to the garden patch, her heels sinking slightly into the soft grass. "Emily," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, "it is so lovely of you to help out with the boys. But I think that's enough gardening for one day. It's time for their educational screen time." Leo and Owen looked up, their faces falling. "We want to stay with Emily," Leo said, a hint of the old defiance in his voice. "Nonsense, darling," Charlotte said, smiling brightly. "Auntie Charlotte knows what's best. We'll watch a wonderful documentary about the migratory patterns of the Arctic tern. It's much more stimulating than playing in the mud." She reached for Owen's hand, but he pulled it away. Emily stood up, wiping her dirty hands on her jeans. She looked at Charlotte, her expression polite but firm. "Mr. Anderson said I could do this my way for a week," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And my way is to let them choose." She then turned to the boys. "It's your afternoon. What would you like to do?" Leo and Owen looked at their aunt, then at Emily. For the first time, they had a real choice. And they made it. "We want to save the roses," Owen said, pointing to the struggling bush. Charlotte's face tightened. To be overruled by her nephews in favor of a maid's daughter was an insult she could not stomach. She gave James a look that was pure ice. "We will discuss this later," she said, before turning on her heel and stalking back into the house. The air was thick with tension after she left. But Emily just smiled at the boys and handed them the watering can. "A rose bush is a very brave thing," she said softly. "It has thorns to protect itself, but it still opens up and shows its beauty to the world. It knows that you can be strong and soft at the same time." As James watched them, he knew that his sister was a storm on the horizon. She would not give up easily. She saw the boys as a project, a reflection of the Anderson name. Emily, he was beginning to realize, saw something else entirely. She saw two small, brave boys who just needed someone to help them find their own son. Charlotte did not give up. She was a woman who saw a problem and immediately began to formulate a strategy for its annihilation. Emily was no longer just a nuisance. She was an obstacle. And Charlotte had a lifetime of experience in removing obstacles. She arrived the next day under the guise of a peace offering. A trip to the city's largest and most expensive toy store. It was a place of overwhelming sensory input, a cathedral of plastic and noise, with aisles stacked to the ceiling with every conceivable form of entertainment. It was, in short, the last place on earth Emily would have chosen to take the boys. "It will be a treat," Charlotte announced, her smile as bright and hard as a diamond. "After all their rustic activities, I thought they deserved a bit of modern fun. You can come too, of course, Emily. It will be an excellent opportunity for you to observe proper child engagement." The unspoken message was clear. This was Charlotte's territory. This was a world of price tags and status, a world where Emily, with her quiet ways and her secondhand copy of Treasure Island, would be utterly out of her depth. James, caught off guard by his sister's apparent generosity, agreed. He had a series of back-to-back meetings and was relieved to have the boys occupied. He saw the flicker of hesitation in Emily's eyes, but Charlotte's enthusiasm was a tidal wave, pulling them all along in its wake. The toy store was exactly as chaotic as Emily had feared. Music blared from hidden speakers. A demonstrator sent a drone buzzing over their heads. Children shrieked and ran through the aisles, their hands grabbing at brightly colored boxes. Leo and Owen, who hadn't been in a toy store in over a year, were immediately overwhelmed. They froze just inside the entrance, their eyes wide, their hands clutching the back of Emily's jeans. Charlotte, in her element, took charge. "Now, boys," she said, her voice cutting through the din, "you can each pick out 3 things. Anything you want. Auntie Charlotte will take care of it." This was the ultimate test, a temptation designed to prove her point, that all children, at their core, were greedy and materialistic. She expected them to tear through the store, grabbing the biggest, most expensive toys, proving that Emily's quiet influence was nothing more than a temporary distraction. But they didn't. They clung to Emily, their faces pale. The sheer volume of choice was paralyzing. This wasn't a playroom with a finite number of toys. It was an infinite landscape of desire, and it was terrifying. "It's too loud," Leo whispered, his voice trembling. Emily knelt down, creating a small island of calm in the middle of the chaos. "I know," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It's a lot. Let's make a plan. My great-grandpa always said you should never go into a battle without a map." She looked around, her eyes scanning the store not as a consumer, but as a strategist. "What is the one thing you'd like to be able to do, more than anything else?" Owen thought for a moment. "I want to build a real robot," he said. "One that moves." Leo nodded. "And I want to paint a picture that looks real, like a photograph." "Okay," Emily said. "Those are our missions. We're not here to wander around. We're here to find the robot parts and the special paints. We are on a treasure hunt." She gave them a purpose, a filter through which to see the overwhelming chaos. Suddenly, the store was no longer a confusing maze. It was a map, and they were explorers. Charlotte watched, her smile tightening, as Emily led the boys, not to the flashy, pre-packaged toys at the front of the store, but to the quieter, more creative sections at the back. They spent half an hour in the aisle with building kits, carefully comparing different sets of gears and circuits. They spent another half hour in the art supply section, where Emily showed them the difference between watercolor and acrylic paints, and helped Leo pick out a set of fine-tipped brushes. They emerged from the store an hour later not with armfuls of expensive plastic, but with two modest boxes. Owen had a complex robotics kit that would require weeks of patient work. Leo had a high-quality artist set with a large canvas. They were toys that required thought, effort, and imagination. Charlotte was furious. Her plan had backfired spectacularly. She had tried to drown them in excess, and Emily had taught them how to swim. Well, Charlotte said, forcing a laugh as they got back into the car. That was educational. I suppose simple things appeal to simple people. Emily didn't rise to the bait. She was looking at the boys in the back seat, who were already examining their new treasures, their faces alight with a kind of focused excitement she hadn't seen before. They weren't just excited about the things themselves. They were excited about what they were going to do with them. When they got back to the mansion, James was waiting for them. He had finished his meetings early. So he said, smiling, "Did you buy out the whole store?" "They got two things," Charlotte said, her voice sharp with annoyance. "Some dreadful, complicated kits. Emily's idea, of course. She seems to think that childhood should be a chore." James looked at the boxes his sons were clutching as if they were made of gold. He looked at their faces, which were glowing with pride and purpose. He had bought them hundreds of toys, toys that were played with for an hour and then forgotten. He had never once thought to buy them a project. "I think," he said slowly, looking at Emily with a newfound respect, "that it was a brilliant idea." Charlotte's face hardened. She saw that she was losing. And when Charlotte Davis started to lose, she stopped playing by the rules. The storm broke the next day. It came, as most storms do, without warning, on a bright, sunny afternoon. James was in his home office, on a conference call with his board of directors, when he heard a scream from the direction of the living room. It was not a child's scream of frustration or play. It was a scream of genuine terror. He slammed the phone down and ran. He burst into the living room to find a scene of pure chaos. Charlotte was on the floor, cradling her arm, her face contorted in pain. A heavy, ornate vase lay shattered on the marble floor beside her. And standing a few feet away, frozen in horror, were Leo and Owen. Emily was standing behind them, her face ashen. "My arm!" Charlotte cried, tears streaming down her face. "I think it's broken. They threw a ball in the house. They hit me with it." Emily was right there. She did nothing to stop them. James's blood ran cold. He looked at his sons, who were staring at their aunt, their expressions a mixture of fear and confusion. He looked at the shattered vase, a priceless heirloom that had belonged to his grandmother. "Boys," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What happened?" "We were just playing catch," Leo whispered, his eyes filling with tears. "It was an accident." "An accident?" Charlotte shrieked, cradling her arm as if it were a wounded bird. "They were being wild, completely out of control. I told them to stop, but they wouldn't listen. And she pointed a trembling finger at Emily. She encouraged them. She said they needed to release their energy. I could have been blinded." James looked at Emily, his face a grim mask. "Is this true?" Emily's heart was pounding. She knew what this looked like. She knew that Charlotte had set a trap, and she had walked right into it. She had been in the kitchen getting the boys a snack. She had heard them playing, a little rambunctiously, but she hadn't thought anything of it. She had come back into the room just in time to see the ball slip from Owen's hands, sail through the air, and strike the vase, sending it crashing to the floor. Charlotte, who had been standing right next to it, had let out a theatrical scream and collapsed. "They were playing," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. "It was an accident. The vase." "So you admit it," Charlotte interrupted, her voice triumphant. "You were supervising them, and you allowed them to destroy a priceless family antique and injure me. This is what happens when you leave children in the care of another child. It's negligence, James. Pure and simple." James felt a wave of dizziness. All his worst fears were coming true. He had trusted a little girl, and his sons had gotten out of control. His sister was hurt. His property was destroyed. The fragile piece of the past few days shattered like the vase on the floor. "Emily," he said, his voice cold and hard. "Go home. We'll talk about this later." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. She looked at him, her eyes pleading. She opened her mouth to try to explain, to tell him that Charlotte was exaggerating, that her arm was fine, that this was all a performance. But she saw the look on his face, the anger, the disappointment, the doubt, and she knew that he wouldn't believe her. Not now. She turned and walked out of the room. Her small shoulders slumped in defeat. Leo and Owen started to cry, not because they were in trouble, but because their friend, the one person who had understood them, was being sent away. As soon as Emily was gone, Charlotte's demeanor began to shift. The hysterical tears subsided, replaced by a cool, calculating look. "James, darling," she said, getting to her feet and gingerly flexing her supposedly broken arm. "You see? I told you this was a mistake. These boys need a firm hand. They need professional help. My friend, the one who runs the boarding school in Switzerland, has 2 openings for the fall term." James stared at his sister. He looked at her perfectly fine arm. He looked at the shattered vase. And then he looked at his 2 sons, who were huddled together on the sofa, sobbing as if their hearts were broken. He had been so quick to believe the worst. He had seen the chaos, and his mind had immediately jumped to the conclusion that Charlotte had so skillfully prepared for him. But now, in the quiet aftermath, the pieces weren't fitting together. Charlotte's miraculous recovery was a little too quick. Her pitch for the boarding school was a little too polished. And his sons, he had never seen them look so utterly lost. Not even after their mother had died. In sending Emily away, he realized with a sinking heart he had taken their anchor. He walked over to the security panel on the wall, the one that controlled the cameras he had installed throughout the house after his wife's death. He had told himself they were for security, but he knew they were really for his own peace of mind, a way to keep an eye on his sons when he wasn't there. He rarely looked at the footage. "What are you doing?" Charlotte asked, her voice suddenly sharp. "Just checking something," James said, his fingers flying across the keypad. He brought up the footage from the living room camera for the past 10 minutes. He watched in silence as the whole scene played out on the small screen. He saw Leo and Owen tossing a small, soft foam ball back and forth. He saw them laughing. He saw Charlotte walk into the room and stand directly beside the vase, her back to the boys. He saw the ball slip from Owen's hand. It wasn't a wild throw. It was a simple, clumsy mistake. It sailed harmlessly past Charlotte, hit the vase, and knocked it over. And he saw his sister, after a deliberate pause, throw herself to the floor and begin to scream. The truth was laid bare in the cold, silent pixels of the video recording. It was a lie. A cruel, calculated lie, designed to manipulate him and get rid of an 11-year-old girl. He turned to face his sister, and for the first time in his life, she saw a look in his eyes that truly frightened her. It was not the look of a grieving, uncertain man. It was the look of a titan of industry who had just been betrayed. "Get out," he said, his voice lethally quiet. Charlotte's face went white. "James, I was just—" "You lied to me," he said, his voice shaking with a cold, controlled rage. "You used my children. You tried to destroy a little girl who has done more for this family in 5 days than you have in 2 years. Get out of my house." Now, Charlotte, for once in her life, was speechless. She gave him one last, venomous look, then turned and swept out of the room, the queen of a kingdom that had just been taken from her. James stood in the silent, wreckage-strewn living room. The relief he expected to feel was absent. All he felt was a profound, gut-wrenching shame. He had failed the test. He had doubted the one person who had shown his sons nothing but kindness and understanding. He had to fix this. He ran out of the house, not even bothering to close the door behind him. He got into his car and drove, faster than he should have, to the small, neat house on the other side of town where his housekeeper lived. He found Emily sitting on her front porch swing, her copy of Treasure Island lying unread in her lap. Her eyes were red from crying. He walked up the steps and stood before her, a billionaire in a $1,000 suit, feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. "Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am so sorry. I was wrong. I should have trusted you." Emily looked up at him, her expression a mixture of sadness and a wisdom far beyond her years. "My great-grandpa used to say that trust is like a mirror," she said quietly. "Once it's broken, you can put the pieces back together, but you'll always see the cracks." James's heart ached. "I know," he said, "but I'm asking you to help me try. Please, come back. The boys, they need you. I need you." It was an admission of vulnerability he had never made to anyone. He wasn't a billionaire asking for a service. He was a father asking for help. Emily looked at him for a long moment, her clear blue eyes searching his face. Then, she gave a small, hesitant nod. "Okay, Mr. Anderson," she said. For the boys. We have 2 days left in our week. Let's not waste them. As they drove back to the mansion, a fragile hope began to mend the cracks in the mirror. The storm had passed, but everyone knew that the landscape had been changed forever. The morning after the storm with Charlotte felt different. The air in the mansion, usually heavy with unspoken grief and tension, was clearer, as if a window had been opened in a stuffy room. The shattered vase had been cleaned up, but the empty space where it had stood for 50 years was a silent testament to the previous day's events. It was a space waiting to be filled with something new. Emily arrived not to the sullen silence she had grown accustomed to, but to a thrum of quiet anticipation. Leo and Owen were waiting for her in the playroom, their treasures from the toy store laid out on the large central table like sacred artifacts. Owen had the robotics kit, its hundreds of tiny pieces still sealed in their plastic bags. Leo had his canvas set up on a small easel he'd found in a storage closet, his new brushes and paints arranged in a neat row. There was no talk of the previous day, no mention of their aunt, or the broken vase, or the terrible accusation. Children, Emily knew, had a remarkable capacity for living in the present. The past was a shadow they could outrun, as long as the sun was shining today. And today, the sun was shining. "I don't know where to start," Owen said, looking at the complex diagram of the robot's interior. It looked like the blueprint of a spaceship, a chaotic map of wires and gears. "It's too hard. My great-grandpa said that the only way to build something big is to start with one small, perfect piece," Emily said, pulling up a chair. She didn't touch the box. She didn't point to the instructions. She just sat with him. He was a machinist in the Navy after the war. He built engines. He said you can't think about the whole engine at once, or your brain will get tangled. You just have to think about the first bolt. You find it, you put it in the right place, and you make it tight. Then you think about the next one. Owen looked at the sea of plastic parts, then back at the diagram. He pointed a small finger at a tiny, insignificant-looking screw. "That one," he said. "Number A1. For the next hour, that was their entire world. They found screw A1. They found the small plastic housing it was meant to secure. They used the tiny screwdriver that came with the kit, and with a focus that was almost meditative, Owen attached the first piece of his robot. It was a small, simple victory, but it was a victory, and it was his. Meanwhile, Leo stood before his blank white canvas, paralyzed by its emptiness. He held a paintbrush in his hand, but he didn't move. "What if I mess it up?" he asked, his voice a small whisper. Emily walked over and stood beside him, her gaze soft and encouraging. "My great-grandpa painted," she said. "Not with brushes like these. He painted ships. Big ones. He'd stand on a scaffold with a huge bucket of gray paint. He said that the first stroke is the scariest because it changes everything. It means the ship isn't just a dream anymore. It's becoming real." She paused, looking at the pristine canvas. "But he also said that a painting isn't about being perfect. It's about being brave. It's about putting a color on the canvas that wasn't there before. Every single painting in the world started with one brave stroke on an empty canvas." Leo looked at the array of colors on his palette. He dipped his brush into a bright, sunny yellow. He hesitated for a second. Then, with a deep breath, he made a single, bold streak across the top of the canvas. The color was brilliant, alive against the stark white. It wasn't the sun. It wasn't a flower. It was just yellow. And it was a start. A brave stroke. He looked at Emily and smiled. A real, unburdened smile. She smiled back. James watched them from the doorway, unseen. He had canceled all his meetings for the day. For the first time since Eleanor had passed, the multi-billion-dollar corporation he had built felt secondary. His real work was here, in this room. He watched as Emily moved between his two sons, a quiet, steady presence. She wasn't a teacher in the traditional sense. She didn't give them answers. She gave them something far more valuable. She gave them the confidence to find their own. She was like a master gardener, tending to two fragile seedlings, knowing that her job wasn't to force them to grow, but to provide the right conditions, the light, the water, the space, so they could grow on their own. He saw his sons not as problems to be managed, but as individuals with their own passions, their own fears, their own unique ways of seeing the world. Owen, the engineer, needed logic and order, the satisfaction of fitting the pieces together to create a functional whole. Leo, the artist, needed freedom and expression, the joy of creating beauty out of nothing. For 2 years, James had been trying to force them both into the same round hole of what he thought normal boyhood should be. Emily had shown him that they were two entirely different shapes, and that both were perfect. Later that afternoon, James found Emily in the library, carefully placing her worn copy of Treasure Island back on a shelf. "They're still working," he said, his voice filled with a quiet wonder. "They haven't fought once. They haven't even asked to watch television. They don't need to fight," Emily said, turning to face him. "They have a mission. My great-grandpa said that when a crew is busy building something together, they don't have time to argue about who gets the best bunk." "This great-grandfather of yours," James said with a small smile. "He seems to have had an answer for everything." "He listened a lot," Emily replied simply. "He said that most people don't really listen. They just wait for their turn to talk. When you really listen, you start to hear what people are trying to say, even when they're not using words." The simple truth of her statement hit James with the force of a physical blow. When was the last time he had truly listened to his sons? He had heard their tantrums, their demands, their arguments. But had he ever listened to the silence in between? Had he ever tried to hear the grief, the fear, the confusion that was fueling all that noise? He had been so focused on managing the storm, he had never thought to ask what was causing the turbulent waters. He had been so busy trying to fix them, he had never stopped to simply be with them. "Emily," he said, his voice earnest, "I want you to stay. Not just for the rest of the week. I want to hire you. Permanently. You can name your price. I'll hire a tutor to handle their schooling. You can just be here. With them. Do what you've been doing." It was the offer of a lifetime. A salary that could change her and her mother's lives forever. But Emily shook her head, her expression gentle but firm. "You still don't get it. Do you, Mr. Anderson?" she said. James was taken aback. "Get what?" "I can't be their anchor," she said. "A friend can't be an anchor. A nanny can't be an anchor. Even a great-grandpa who knows everything about ships can't be an anchor. There's only one person who can be their anchor. And it's you." She took a small step closer, her gaze direct and unwavering. "They don't need a new captain, Mr. Anderson. They just need their father. They need you to sit on the floor and help them find Screw A1. They need you to be brave and put the first stroke of paint on the canvas with them. They need you to build a pillow fort and eat peanut butter sandwiches in the dark." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I can't stay forever. I have my own ship to build. But you're their harbor. You're the one they're supposed to come home to. This week, this wasn't about me fixing your sons. This was about me showing you how." The silence that followed was profound. In that moment, James Anderson wasn't a billionaire. He was just a father who had been shown the blueprint of his own heart. He had been looking for a solution he could buy, a professional he could hire, a system he could implement. He had never realized that the solution was not a person or a price tag. It was a choice to be present. He nodded slowly, a wave of understanding and a deep, humbling gratitude washing over him. "Thank you, Emily," he whispered. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. He walked out of the library and went to the playroom. He didn't stand in the doorway this time. He walked in and sat down on the floor next to Owen. He picked up the complicated diagram. "All right, Mr. Engineer," he said, his voice a little rough with emotion. "Show me where we are. What's the next piece of this puzzle?" Owen's face lit up with a smile so bright it could have powered the entire mansion. From across the room, Leo looked up from his painting, a silent, hopeful question in his eyes. "We'll get to yours next, Mr. Artist," James said, his heart swelling. "I think that sky needs a little more blue." For the rest of the day, the three of them worked. They built, they painted, they talked. They didn't solve all their problems. The grief of their loss was still there, a quiet undercurrent in the room. But for the first time, they were navigating the waters together. The captain was finally on the deck with his crew, and the ship was slowly, surely, beginning to turn its bow toward home. The final day of the trial week arrived with a quiet solemnity. It was a Saturday. Sarah, Emily's mother, had the day off, but Emily came to the mansion anyway. She said she had to see the projects through. Everyone knew it was more than that. It was an ending, and it had to be honored. The robot was finished. It was a small, clumsy-looking thing, but when Owen flipped a switch on its back, it walked. It took 3 stiff, robotic steps across the table before toppling over. Owen didn't care. He let out a whoop of pure joy. He had built something that worked. He had taken a box of chaos and turned it into a creation. Leo's painting was also done. It wasn't a masterpiece. The perspective was a little off, and the colors were a bit muddy in places. But it was vibrant and full of feeling. It was a painting of a garden. In the center was a single, brave rose bush, its thorns sharp, its blooms a brilliant, defiant red. In the sky above, a bright yellow sun, the first brave stroke he had made, shone down on everything. They stood in the playroom, the three of them, looking at their accomplishments. James stood with them, not as a supervisor, but as a participant. He had a smudge of blue paint on his cheek and a new understanding in his eyes. "So," James said, his voice gentle, "this is it. The week is over." Leo and Owen grew quiet. They looked at Emily, their expressions clouded with the imminent pain of a goodbye. They had had so many goodbyes in their young lives. "Are you leaving?" Owen asked, his voice a small, tight knot. Emily knelt down, so she was at their eye level. "I have to go home," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean I'm leaving. A harbor is a place you leave from, so you can go on adventures. But it's always the place you come back to. I'll come visit. We'll be friends. But I can't stay here." She looked at James. "They don't need me to stay here," she said. Her words meant for him as much as for the boys. "They have their harbor now." James knew she was right. But the thought of the house returning to its old, sad silence was unbearable. He had one more card to play. One final, grand gesture from a man who was used to solving problems with his checkbook. "Sarah," he said, turning to Emily's mother, who had just arrived to pick her up. "I would like to make you a proposal. I want to pay off your mortgage. I want to set up a college fund for Emily, enough to send her to any university in the world." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was a life-changing amount of money, a fairy tale offer. In return, James continued, looking at Emily, "I'm not asking you to be a nanny. I'm asking you to be a consultant, an advisor. I want you to come here once a week and just talk to me. Tell me what you see. Help me stay on course." It was a desperate, clumsy attempt to keep her in their lives, to formalize the magic she had brought into his home. But it was Emily who answered, her voice filled with a gentle, unyielding strength. This was the final lesson, the powerful twist that would change everything. "You don't need to buy my friendship, Mr. Anderson," she said, her quiet words cutting through his grand offer. "And you don't need to pay me to see things. All you have to do is open your own eyes." She walked over to the playroom window, which overlooked the sprawling, immaculate gardens. "You have all this land," she said, "acres and acres of perfect grass. But the boys don't need perfect grass." She pointed to the small, forgotten patch behind the guest house, where they had pulled the weeds and saved the single rose bush. "They need that," she said. "They need a place where they can get their hands dirty. A place where things can be messy and imperfect and still be beautiful. A place that's theirs." Then she delivered the final, powerful truth, the one that would reshape the Anderson legacy forever. "My great-grandpa told me something else," she said, her voice clear and strong, filling the quiet room. "He said that the richest man in the world isn't the one with the most money. It's the one with the strongest anchor. He said a man can own a dozen houses and still be homeless. But if he builds a real home, a place of safety and love, then he owns the whole world." She turned from the window and looked at the billionaire, the housekeeper, and the two little boys. "Stop trying to buy them a perfect childhood, Mr. Anderson," she said. "Just be brave enough to build one with them. That's all they've ever wanted." With that, she took her mother's hand. "Come on, Mom," she said. "Let's go home." James watched them leave. He didn't try to stop them. The urge to write a check, to make a deal, to control the situation was gone. In its place was a quiet, profound clarity. He was the harbor. The next morning, James Anderson, CEO and titan of industry, did not go to the office. He went to the local hardware store. He came back not with a team of professional landscapers, but with shovels, bags of soil, and a dozen small, hopeful rose bushes. He found his sons in the playroom, quietly looking at their finished projects. "Come on, boys," he said, a genuine smile on his face. "We have work to do. We're building a garden." And so they did. Father and sons, they dug in the dirt. They got mud on their clothes and blisters on their hands. They tore up a large patch of the perfect, useless lawn and created something new. It wasn't neat or professionally designed. It was messy and a little crooked, but it was theirs. They were not just planting roses. They were planting roots. A few weeks later, a small package arrived for Emily. Inside was a beautiful, leather-bound journal. On the first page, in James Anderson's elegant handwriting, was a short note. "For all the stories you have yet to write," it said, "and for the one you helped us begin. You were right. Trust is like a mirror. The cracks will always be there. But now, when we look in it, we don't just see what's broken. We see the three of us, putting the pieces back together. And that's a beautiful reflection. Thank you for teaching a king that his greatest treasure wasn't in his castle, but in his own backyard." Emily smiled. She knew that the Anderson mansion was no longer a silent, sad museum. It was a home. The storm had passed. The ship was safe in its harbor. And a quiet, 11-year-old girl with blonde hair, the daughter of a maid and the relative of a legendary war veteran, had proven that the most powerful force in the world isn't wealth or power. It's the simple, revolutionary act of truly seeing another person and having the courage to help them see themselves. 6 months later, the first real winter snow fell on the Anderson estate. It was a quiet, gentle fall, blanketing the world in a soft, forgiving white. Inside the mansion, the silence was no longer a fragile, tense thing. It was a comfortable quiet, filled with the low hum of a contented home. The grand living room, once a cold and sterile museum, now bore the marks of a lived-in life. A half-finished Lego castle sat on the expensive rug, and a colorful, slightly crooked painting, Leo's second masterpiece, a portrait of the family, hung proudly in the empty space where the antique vase used to be. The biggest change, however, was outside. The garden, which had been just a muddy patch of earth when they started, had become a sprawling, beautiful mess. Even under a blanket of snow, the trellises and raised beds gave it a sense of structure and promise. It was a place of rest, a testament to the work they had put in. James Anderson now measured his days not by stock market fluctuations, but by the slow, patient rhythm of the seasons. He had traded late nights at the office for early evenings with his sons, poring over seed catalogs and planning their spring planting. Leo and Owen were transformed. The constant, simmering anger had dissipated, replaced by a boisterous and creative energy. Owen was building a new, more complex robot. This time with a rudimentary AI, he was learning to code with his father's help. Leo had filled a dozen canvases with his art, his style growing bolder and more confident with each one. They still fought, as brothers do, but their fights were brief squalls now, not hurricanes. They had learned to navigate their own emotional weather, knowing their father was the calm harbor they could always return to. Emily visited every Saturday. Her relationship with the family had settled into a comfortable, easy friendship. James had honored her wish. She was not a consultant, and she was not on the payroll. She was simply Emily, a friend who came over to share pizza and build Legos. He had, however, quietly paid off her mother's mortgage, sending the final payment to the bank anonymously. When Sarah received the letter confirming her house was paid for, she had simply looked at her daughter and smiled, a silent understanding passing between them. One snowy Saturday afternoon, the four of them were in the kitchen, a room that had once been the exclusive domain of staff. They were making hot chocolate from scratch, a messy, chaotic process involving spilled cocoa powder and sticky marshmallows. James was laughing, a real, deep belly laugh, as Owen tried to use a robotic arm of his own design to stir the pot. "Dad, it's more efficient this way," Owen insisted as the arm sloshed chocolate onto the pristine white countertop. "Efficiency isn't the point, Mr. Engineer," James said, ruffling his son's hair. "Sometimes, the mess is the best part." Emily watched them, a quiet smile on her face. She saw the cracks in the mirror, still there, but they were no longer signs of breakage. They were the beautiful, intricate lines on a map, showing the journey they had taken to find their way back to each other. The billionaire had learned that his greatest assets weren't listed on any stock exchange. They were here, in this warm, messy kitchen covered in chocolate. The maid's daughter had taught them all that a home isn't built with money or things, but with moments. And on that snowy afternoon, they were building a fortress of them, one sticky, wonderful moment at a time. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.